Many people have said they know they're at Chautauqua when they look down the streets and they see the blue water of the lake. But the lake has always had a very important recreational function, and recreation is one of the key elements of the Chautauqua identity and program.
Chautauqua Institution, founded in 1874 on the shores of Chautauqua Lake in western New York, is a place where thinkers, artists, musicians, writers, and theologians come together for lectures, performances, and discussions. And the founders of Chautauqua chose this location because of its peaceful, natural setting. They also believed that learning, reflection, and spiritual growth could best happen in a tranquil, beautiful environment, which Chautauqua Lake was perfect for. But environmental changes to the lake have made it difficult for Chautauquans to enjoy the lake the way it once was.
Typically, if it rains really hard and runs everything into the lake, and then you have a nice calm day like today and it gets hot out, you'll start to see those algal blooms pop up within a few days.
So Chautauqua Lake is actually quite clean. It's one of the cleanest lakes in our region, but that comes with a giant caveat, which is that most lakes, freshwater lakes in the United States, suffer for some degree of environmental problems. And our lake is no exception, and harmful algae blooms is probably the biggest one that we have here at Chautauqua Lake.
So Chautauqua Lake is classified as a productive system. It's called a eutrophic. When you look at the spectrum of lakes, we have lakes that are sort of clear blue, low productivity systems. And on the other end, we have our high productivity systems that have a lot of biological growth, a lot of green in the water, not very clear, not very transparent. And if we have enough of that growth, it can affect water quality and change the way that people interact with the system.
It would seem there have always been weeds in the lake. I mean, it even shows up in Indian stories about the lake. So there have always been weeds. But the algae bloom problem probably has been very much aggravated by the phosphates going into the lake. But again, that is very much the encroachment on the lake that has caused much of that problem.
It's a relatively shallow lake for its size, so it's receiving a lot of water. We have 300 miles of streams and creeks that feed into Chautauqua Lake coming directly from the watershed with very little slowdown in between. And then we have human development and activity on the landscape. And so all of those things sort of feed into this warm, shallow lake, which would probably be naturally productive if nobody was here. We kind of have thrown things out of balance and sort of turned up the dial on the conditions that are ideal for those cyanobacteria growth.
I've been coming here since the 1980s, and so over that period of time, I don't see much of a change. I think it's because we recognize more that the green pea soup that we see in the lake annually, we recognize it now to be algae, and that it's potentially harmful to your health if it's a toxic algal bloom.
So harmful algal blooms is sort of a generic term for rapid growth of algae and or cyanobacteria.
A lot of people believe that the weeds are a big problem, and some people get stuck in their boats in the weeds. The weeds are necessary to keep the water clean, but they're also great for the fisheries. There are a lot of great fish here. This is a world-class fishing lake, but we believe that the algal blooms are the biggest problem because that affects the entire lake no matter where you are. It closes beaches, it prevents people from swimming, it can hurt animals who go into the lake if it's the toxic kind.
With algae being the biggest problem within the lake, how does it get there?
They grow like many terrestrial plants, like many land-based plants, where they need light and certain nutrients, the right temperature range for those species, and when they have the right conditions, they grow quite quickly. So in lake ecosystems, most of the time we see blooms triggered by excessive nitrogen and phosphorus that are getting into the lake ecosystem. So at Chautauqua Lake, we have fairly high nutrient values for nitrogen and phosphorus, and we have a lot of human activity around the lake. So we're also operating under a warming climate, and those increases in temperatures with the extra nutrients really sort of set the stage for the cyanobacteria to grow beyond what they would normally grow.
Those nutrients are getting into the lake in two ways. One is they're washing in from stormwater.
If you kind of think about the long story of how material moves into the lake, right? So if you think about the landscape around a lake basin, if you put a drop of water on that land, it's going to move down or it's going to fall down slope. But there's a lot of pathways it could go, right? There's a lot of different things it could encounter. And in the natural world, the natural ecosystem, there's going to be lots of places for that water to stop and pause and be taken up, right, by other organisms living on the landscape. So nutrients get dissolved into the water through various processes and then transported, but on an undeveloped landscape, there's lots of stopping points, right? Lots of pause points and opportunities for those nutrients to be resorbed, so that when the water gets to the lake eventually, it's not carrying so much material with it. When we as people develop the landscape, we do things like put in parking lots and roadways, and we have roofs on our houses, and all of that impermeable surface, right, just allows water to sort of sheet off and move really quickly without encountering anything that will take the nutrients back out. So that's where human development and interaction is really important, because we've changed the way water moves, and ultimately that changes what happens in the lake.
The other is that there's a legacy of sediments on the bottom of the lake, phosphorus and nitrogen and other pollutants, that sometimes under certain conditions get reliberated into the water. So you've got nutrients coming in from above and from below, and all of that feeds an excessive growth of vegetation, which in turn can feed harmful algae blooms.
Our bottom of our lake has been receiving the nutrients for centuries, right? And so that bottom, as the muck builds up on the bottom, it's full of nutrients. And when the oxygen levels above that water, above that muck on the bottom are depleted, that releases those nutrients into the water column, and that allows those nutrients to feed the algae, especially when you get a big rainfall on the land, and all of that water is going to flow into the lake with silt and dirt nutrients that come into the lake, and it collides with those nutrients coming up from the bottom. We believe that that's where we're seeing algal blooms happen.
What I've certainly seen at Chautauqua Lake, and this is not just Chautauqua, but at a lot of different systems, we're realizing that the spatial dynamics matter a lot. And so where blooms maybe originate versus where they accumulate, how they sort of grow and increase, hang out, and then eventually dissipate, that has a lot to do with lake physics and internal conditions that are changing. So the idea of understanding more about bloom dynamics in space and time is really critical as we try to understand what sets them off.
Algae is a naturally occurring part of the lake, and it's a part of the environment that we all need. But when it gets out of control, when it grows too much and too fast, it can cause a problem. And sometimes that algae can turn toxic. And that's what we're really worried about. When that algae turns toxic, it becomes unsafe for swimming, unsafe for pets, unsafe for drinking.
That toxin production by cyanobacteria at Chautauqua Lake is really where most of the problem lies. So the cyanobacteria also are capable of producing a whole range of toxins. There's neurological toxins, there's hepatotoxins, so things that can affect everything from your brain to your liver, and also likely other things we haven't even measured fully or fully understood.
It's especially deadly for dogs, right? So humans may experience some intestinal discomfort and some illness. Dogs can actually die from exposure to harmful algae blooms. They can die very quickly. They can go into respiratory shock. And so it's especially concerning when we have a harmful algae bloom to keep pets out of the water.
So as people or animals swim or drink lake water that has toxins in it during a bloom event, they ingest that toxin with it, and then from there it has these different, depending on the toxin, has different effects on your internal physiology. When pets like dogs, for example, go into the water, they get all that material basically filtered onto their bodies, onto their fur, and then they'll groom themselves when they come out, and that's how they ingest. There's other ecological things that can happen as a result too. That biomass, when it's done, when it's done growing and it's sort of reached the end of its bloom span, it dies back and then gets decomposed by bacteria at the bottom of the lake, and that uses up oxygen. And when there's no oxygen present, you can have a fish kill, because fish need oxygen to survive.
Algae is a natural part of our ecosystem. It's an important part of the lake. It's an important food source for lots of organisms that live in the lake. But when it is overfed with these nutrients, with nitrogen and phosphorus primarily, it gets out of balance. And when it gets out of balance, it can turn toxic. And so that's the situation we're trying to address.
It's really this public health piece where where the rubber meets the road, right? That's where we really want to start to take action on blooms, because it's possible that when you have a bloom, it might be toxic, and then therefore it's not safe to recreate in or to spend time in. And that affects swimming, boating, it affects tourism industry, and it's really important to keep people safe.
It would take massive amounts of study and analysis to answer the questions researchers at Chautauqua Lake have, but luckily some of the most advanced lake research in the world is being done right here.
As we speak, there's a couple of floating supercomputers in our lake right now, taking thousands of measurements a second on all kinds of environmental parameters.
The Jefferson project at Chautauqua Lake is taking samples regularly. Our researchers at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute are taking that data, as well as the IBM researchers, and compiling what they're finding and creating models, actual computer simulation models that are used to show people what's happening in the lake. And when we can identify all of the reasons for these to be happening, these algal blooms and even the growth of the weeds, then we can say for sure how to attack the problem, or at least try pilot projects to attack the problems.
It was never really fully understood how water moved within our lake. Chautauqua Lake has two distinct basins, a deeper north basin where the institution is located, a shallower south basin. And previously it was thought that there wasn't much water interchange between those two basins. And so in fact, in the shallower basin where vegetation grows to the surface much more readily, a lot of the towns in that area have wanted to dump herbicides in the lake to kill that vegetation to, so that their boating experience is better. But now we know that herbicides put in the South Basin are going to make their way to our water intake, drinking water intake here in the North Basin. So the Jefferson project, with all of its advanced equipment, has created a really complex model of water movements in our lake that we didn't have that information previously. We've also learned that when lake vegetation dies and falls to the bottom, it creates a zero oxygen kind of environment. That's exactly the kind of condition that it takes to re-liberate suspended nutrients in the sediment.
The longest set of data, which dates back over 30 years, suggests that the amount of algae in the lake has stayed relatively the same.
We see high values for chlorophyll, which is the pigment that algae and cyanobacteria use to do the work for photosynthesis. And so more pigment, more chlorophyll means more presence of algae and cyanos. So chlorophyll has been high, but not really changing in trend over the last 36 years. Phosphorus is an important limiting nutrient for algae and cyanobacteria to grow. It's one of those things that if you give them more of it, it's one of the triggers that can set them off. And this is the one that is increasing over the last 36-year time span, and it's also increasing if you look at just the last 10 years as well.
We know that they don't happen as much in the colder months, so we know that heat has a lot to do with it. We also know that that heavy winds will often break up algae blooms. It doesn't mean that they go away, it just means you don't see them at the surface. One of the things that we learned with the Jefferson project is that algae persists throughout the entire water column. And so we see algae manifest at the surface in terms of these big green mats. And it was thought at one time that we could simply scrape those mats away and get rid of the problem. But again, a new thing that we've learned as a result of our research is that the algae isn't just at the surface, it's existing throughout the entire water column.
We focus a bit more on nutrients and trying to find ways to, number one, reduce nutrient input into the system, or number two, understand what's happening within the lake to possibly mitigate nutrients within the lake itself. Most of the work that's been done so far, it has been on the watershed. So working on the landscape around the lake to try to basically turn off the tap, turn off the supply as much as we can. So things like looking at permeable pavement that allows water to soak down, preserving, protecting wetlands, like swales and rain gardens, shoreline buffers using native plants, which are very good at taking up a lot of water in this environment, are all ways that people can sort of start to slow down that traveling nutrients, right, the stream coming in.
If you create wetlands and rain gardens along the shoreline that divert the water from the tributaries that are flowing into the lake and slow the water down, it'll help to absorb the nutrients on the land, and the plants on land will absorb the nutrients, and that'll keep it out of the lake. If we could get the municipalities to have regulations or at least suggestions, strongly urged suggestions to community members around the lake, and also developers who are going to build things around the lake that require or suggest that they have a maximum impervious surface ratio, possibly build rain gardens on their own property, plant trees, and indigenous plantings around the lakefronts, then I think within 10 years or so, we could see some levels of improvement incrementally.
So I don't think we'll ever get rid of them entirely, but I think we can dial back on the intensity if we can start to reduce that nutrient availability for the cyanobacteria.
I think it would be great if we restored the shoreline. If we have now, I've heard as low as 8% of the shoreline, maybe 12% of the shoreline is natural, and often not in the best of places. If we could turn that around and have 80, 90% of the shoreline natural, I think we would see a very different lake.
If humans cease to exist in this region, nature would recover on its own in a certain amount of time, but that's not going to happen, right? We're here to stay. And so there will continue to be human impacts. There'll continue to be runoff and pollution. And so the work of protecting our environment is ongoing.
The condition of this lake happened over centuries. So it's not going to be a quick fix. It's not going to be a turnaround even potentially within one generation, which it makes it hard for people to invest in because they're not going to potentially may not see the benefit for years and years.
It's really amazing to see people be so passionate about a lake and get really fired up and really want to be part of moving it forward.
What we're hoping to do here in Chautauqua is not only solve the problem for our lake, but serve as a model that can help other lakes around the world solve this problem.